I should not be on mute. I did not mute it. Interesting. Someone else muted it. Okay. So hopefully you didn't hear any of that, and I'll do it all again. So hopefully you can hear this now. I'm off mute. What I said to you guys was that welcome, and also that we are going to be taking questions at the end, and if you type your questions at any time into the chat function, and we'll show you where that is by sending you a link to the book, and so you can use that link to find your way to the chat function, and that way you can ask your question as you go, and at the end of the event it'll be texted to me and I'll be able to ask Katherine your question, so that's really good. There was one other thing I was going to tell you. Yes, if you would like a personally signed copy, if you're in the room, all you have to do is go to the counter, purchase it, and then come out for the signing at the end. But if you're not in the room and you would like a personally signed copy, please feel free to call. It's 07 3846 3422, 07 3846 3422. Give us a call and purchase your book. You could pay for postage if you want as well, and we will get it personally dedicated to you, and you can come and pick it up, or we can send it to you afterwards. So that is my housekeeping. And without further ado, I will start the event. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on. In this area, the Yagara and Turrbal people, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any other elders who are here with us tonight. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and sovereignty was never ceded. And because we're on Zoom, we are zooming out onto lots of different Aboriginal lands. And I would like to pay my deepest respects to elders of the lands that you are zooming in from. Now, tonight it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Cass Moriarty, who is going to do our conversation tonight. Cass is a long-time conversation person for Avid, and we haven't had you do a conversation like this for ages. So it's really great to have you back. Cass's novels are available from Avid, including Parting Words and The Promised Seed, which was listed for awards including the 2017 Dublin International Literary Award and the Queensland Literary Awards. Her short fiction and creative non-fiction have been published in the Saturday paper. She is a writing mentor, book critic and reviewer. And her favourite activities is to host conversations with other authors so that she can learn all about their writing secrets, which is fantastic for us because we get to learn about their writing secrets too. So everybody welcome Cass Moriarty.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Avid Reader. Whether you're here in the audience or you're watching with us on Zoom online, thank you for supporting the incredible literary community of authors, publishers and booksellers.
You might not be on your microphone. There's two on buttons.
Are we on?
Yes, there we go.
Hello, can you hear that?
I will turn you up.
We're having a few technical issues tonight. This doesn't normally happen.
Oh, it's just got off.
I can project my voice.
Project for the moment. Your microphone has just dropped down.
It wasn't me. It was it actually was the microphone. So thank you for being here to support the industry generally. Every book that you buy or borrow, every time you make a recommendation or you write a review or you attend a launch, you're supporting the community, and that's really important. So thank you so much for that. I would just like to add on behalf of Katherine, I'm sure, and myself, that we also acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional owners of this land in Brisbane and to all First Nations people who, of course, are and have been the original storytellers for thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of years in this country. Now, I am on mic. Okay, and I'm very excited because tonight, as Chrissy said, is my very first in-person event for the year for Avid, and what a way to begin. Katherine Collette may be known to you as the author of her first novel, The Helpline, which was published in the UK, the US, Germany and Italy. Or you might know her perhaps as the co-host of the extraordinarily popular writing podcast, The First Time. which has been going for about 4 years now, I think. You may not know that she is an engineer and that she used to work with sewage. That's true. Is that on your CV? But tonight we're celebrating the launch of her second novel, The Competition, which is a hilarious, well-crafted and thought-provoking story about competitive public speaking. Please welcome Katherine Collette. So, Katherine, you are here in person in a pandemic. What's it like to be back travelling on a book tour again?
I feel like Jane and I went to a couple of different bookshops today, and I feel like I said this to every bookseller. I am just so grateful to be here and to get the chance to see the book on the shelf, because particularly having lived in Melbourne, I saw a lot of authors with wonderful books come out the last 2 years, and they didn't get that chance.
Well, we're very special. How do you we're not used to it, are we? Interstate people. There was a while I didn't want interstate.
This is our
local people.
This is our second person in a very long time.
Oh, there you go. Very special. Okay, so what I thought we might do to start, for those of you who don't know Katherine, is we're going to do a quick 5.
Okay.
So this is like short answers only, Katherine, just so we can learn a little bit more about you. So quick answers. Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Coffee or wine?
Coffee.
Oh, interesting. Favourite place to write, the mountain or the beach?
The beach.
Yeah, I thought you'd say that. Favourite child? I'm joking. That was just to make sure you're paying attention. Okay, how about this one? Girls' weekend or silent meditation and yoga retreat?
Girls' weekend. Does anyone pick meditation?
There's someone in the audience I'm pretty sure would choose the yoga retreat, but we're not naming any names. She's laughing though, so you know who it is. Okay, last question. Now this can apply to writing, public speaking, or just life in general. Would you prefer to be competing or judging?
Competing.
So quick with the answers. Competing, okay. All right, that makes sense. Yeah. Okay, thank you. All right, so apparently, I did some Googling, and apparently public speaking is the #1 fear for about 75% of the population. Number 2 is death. Also, clowns are officially scarier than ghosts, but zombies are scarier than both. But I digress. That's the rabbit hole you go down. Okay, now the organisation at the centre of your book, which is called SpeechMakers, is loosely based on the worldwide group Toastmasters. Tell us about your own personal experience with Toastmasters, how it informed the novel, and why you are not the subject of a legal defamation action.
Okay, so probably a little over 10 years ago, I swapped jobs. And I had been working in a job where I didn't have to do a lot of public speaking, and I shifted into a job where suddenly I did. And it was very much the bit about this new job that I was least looking forward to. So I sort of deliberated. I had the option of calling in sick every time I thought I would have to speak for the rest of my life, which felt complicated. Or I could try and sort of face my fear and get comfortable with public speaking. So I joined Toastmasters. Have you been to Toastmasters, Kats?
I have not, but I have. I think I might have attended one meeting actually. I think it might have scared me away.
Okay, that might be semi-common. There's a few people nodding that have attended Toastmasters. I always like when people have attended Toastmasters because it's a real shorthand for people to understand what that world is like. My first impressions.
It's a bet.
It's probably learning public speaking is inherently awkward. Toastmasters doesn't really do a lot to make it less awkward. So my first sort of entree into this space was kind of awkward, really welcoming, very, very positive, sort of part of the self-improvement movement, I suppose. But also at that first meeting, so I sort of looked at it as like, this is kind of weird, was sort of my first impression. And then there was a woman at that first meeting who was a transgender woman, and she was getting up to take what's called the Toastmasters Pledge. And that's when you've attended a couple of meetings and you decide, yeah, I'm going to go from visitor to actual Toastmasters. And you pay your money and you fill out your form, and they make you stand up in front of everyone. And you read out this pledge or promise that you'll be the best Toastmaster to your ability, you'll attend club meetings, you'll give people positive feedback and all that sort of stuff. Anyway.
Give them your firstborn child.
Felt like it could go that way. So this woman, Gria was her name. I saw her do this and I got to know her over time. And I learned that she was commencing a process of, she was trans, she was transitioning. And the place where she was starting that process was at Toastmasters, which is pretty profound. And it struck me on a couple of levels. One was I was in no way surprised that she would choose Toastmasters because it was this really positive space, it was this really welcoming space, and it almost felt church-like in how embracing it was. And so I had this dual view from the very beginning, that it was both awkward, a little bit ridiculous, but also really beautiful, because I could think of no better space that would allow you to be that vulnerable.
And one of the characters in the book, Keith, at the beginning, he says, which is something you just touched on, it was inevitable that SpeechMakers would increase in popularity. It was an enterprise based on self-improvement, and there was no shortage of people with selves to improve upon. So the whole sort of bureaucracy and ridiculous power play of these types of organisations really made me cringe with recognition when I was reading this book. If any of you have ever been on a tuck shop committee or a particular kind of voluntary board, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. How did you manage, Katherine, to take these ostensibly very boring sort of infrastructure administrations and find the humour and the absurdity that frame them?
Toastmasters is an interesting one because it's about, I know a lot about it now, having written the book and having researched it, but when it began, it started with the YMCA, and it was both about sort of early 1900s, and it was about a space where people could practice public speaking, but also learn to run meetings. So it always had this meeting running element. Maybe it was part of a movement of people to do different types of work and work in more office-based jobs perhaps. But it has maintained that element of formality. There's a gavel that you bang. You call people Mr. Toastmaster or Madam Toastmaster. There's a lot of moving of motions. It's quite quaint and probably quite dated. But as there often is, I think, in some, tuck shop committees and all the rest of it, there are some individuals that are very attached to those processes and those formalities and like to ding the bell when, there's been a transmission. Literally. And that sort of stuff, which I think, and probably is portrayed in the character of Keith, on first sort of glance feels excessive and over the top, but I think as you kind of was endeared to that over time, like I began to see the point of it. Like the point was not to say, oh, this person has spoken for long enough, the rule is 10 minutes, and cut them off. The point was far more to say everyone gets the chance to speak, and we are sharing the stage, and it's about everybody finding their voice, not just the people with the loudest voices being there.
That's actually a really lovely way to look at it. Now, this sport, the competition, is actually set in Brisbane. Tell us about that. I kind of didn't realise that until I got into it. And then
It is set in Brisbane. I wanted it to be set around a 3-day conference, and I'm from Melbourne. I wanted them to travel, the main characters to travel to the conference. And the only real conference I had ever been to when I'd written the book was in Brisbane. So I said it. The place I felt
Past experience. What comes through. All right, let's talk about some of the main characters. So I thought we might talk a little bit about Frances, Keith, and Neil. So let's start with Frances. why is she even attending this competition when she's supposed to be working behind the deli counter at her local supermarket?
That's right. So Frances is a young woman. She's in her early 20s. She was a straight-A student and a debater, and was sort of someone in high school, but has had a bit of a fall from grace. And so now she works in the delicatessen at the local supermarket, a world that is very familiar for me, having done the same job. But she starts off by calling in sick every day so that she can attend this conference because she doesn't want to use up her annual leave. But she's in it for the money. She really believes.
So what's the money?
The money. So the grand prize for winning the SpeechMakers competition is $40,000. So she's
that's what calling in sick for. Yeah. So when Frances first attends the competition, she is, quote, not hiding, but she is eating her lunch alone and away from other people. Her head, this is a quote, her head throbbing with what she assumes is a migraine but reckons could probably be a brain tumour. Is that indicative of her sort of attitude towards life?
I think so. I think Frances is a bit, maybe she feels a lot of shame, so she's, and a bit of self-loathing as well. So she sort of has an internal voice to herself that is pretty negative. And I think she's probably acutely aware of every ailment in her body and exaggerates.
And as we learn more about Frances as the story develops, we discover that she's done some pretty mean things in the past. It's quite shocking, actually, and it makes us dislike her a little bit. But it also makes us connect with her, I think, because, you know, we've all done mean things and then we've all felt bad about them. So no spoilers, don't give any spoilers, but why is Frances so unsettled by unexpectedly seeing Rebecca, who's a girl from her past?
So Rebecca and Frances used to be best friends, and we hear about the good times in their relationship, but we also hear about less good times. I think one thing that I was interested in was a friend who is a psychologist said that she had sent clients to Toastmasters who had social anxiety. So I was interested in someone attending a public speaking club to kind of cure their social anxiety in some ways. This is kind of how I saw Frances. But some of her past relates to bullying, and she attends an all-girls school. And I was interested in the way that, and maybe it's not particular to girls' schools, but those friendships that swing like pendulums from best friend to mortal enemy to, you know, the different configurations that a small group can take as it sort of divides and reforms.
And it's explored really, really well in the novel. And sort of, it's unexpected that, like, I didn't expect that aspect of it. So that makes it even better. All right, so that's Frances. Then we have Keith. So Keith is a SpeechMakers mentor, which is an experienced member who guides a new member in their journey. The two meet up, quote, to provide feedback and advice, which in Keith's view need not necessarily be limited to SpeechMakers matters or even public speaking techniques, unquote. So Keith, you know, has quite a lot of advice about quite a lot of different things. So I think that quote does say a lot about him, but can you elaborate a bit more about Keith and his character?
Keith has been at SpeechMakers for a long time. He is sort of around the age of retirement. He is desperate to win. He's been competing a long time. He really is, insofar as anyone in the book, is an archetype of someone that I've met at a public speaking club. Keith is definitely is. But I probably think while most of the characters themselves change across the book, I think with Keith, he maybe doesn't change so much, but your perception of him changes.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. But he is very deeply invested, which has good parts.
And he's competing and mentoring, which is kind of an unusual position to be in because, you know, you're mentoring someone that you're then competing against too, which makes it interesting.
Well, I do remember as well from actual Toastmasters, that there were an awful lot of people wanting to be mentors and not many people wanting to be mentors. so you would be offered multiple mentors, which is
I'm not sure what that says, but it says something profound. There was another quote in the book, Keith saying, people seem to think he enjoyed criticising things. In reality, he was simply unusually perceptive. And if you could see there was a lot wrong, how could you not point it out? Like he's such a great character, Keith. He also makes the point that the group should perhaps be called listen makers rather than speech makers, because it's more about listening to other people than speaking yourself. And despite the fact that he's forced to listen to all manner of unusual topics, some of which he has absolutely no interest in, like the birth of someone's child, to a great degree of detail, he recognises that it opens up his world, it introduces him to the challenges and realities of other people's lives, and it provides perhaps some necessary discomfort. Has that been your own experience of public speaking?
It actually was of Toastmasters. So Greer was one member who would talk about aspects of her life, but Toastmasters is very distinct from the moth or other sort of public speaking, storytelling things in that, particularly in the competitive environment, it's much more about inspiring people and telling your life stories and making meaning of the things that have happened to you. I guess that probably applies in some ways more to the competition aspect of Toastmasters, but even at meetings, that's what people talk about. And it can be really confronting. And I think I really reflected on that idea of it being a place where you listen far more than you talk during COVID, because I was stuck at home. You're living in these little bubbles, and generally everyone in your bubble agrees with you, which is great, but it's also not the real world. And so you would see protesters and this anti-vax sort of debate happening outside of your house, but there was no requirement for you at any time to talk to a person who had a different point of view. And I think hearing other people's stories creates empathy. And I think there was increasingly in Melbourne, as lockdowns progressed, a lack of empathy and a lack of compassion, maybe, for alternate perspectives.
Yeah, and certainly in SpeechMakers, they are involved with details of other people, and they hear details of other people's lives that, they ordinarily wouldn't hear. People give very personal speeches, don't they?
They do, and it shocks you what people want to talk about. Like, people can get very deep very quickly. I remember a woman talking about losing a child, like her daughter walked home from school and never made it home. And that was the whole speech, but which is like heavy as an audience, but she wants to share that story, like it is a really interesting thing to have to listen to whatever someone wants to tell you.
So she's obviously getting something out of telling that story, as well as the people who are listening, I guess.
Yeah. And I think also, like, I live in a very multicultural suburb, and just even hearing stories from people who had migrated to Australia in relatively recent times, it's easy for me to think, we're really welcoming, and to hear stories that really presented an alternative to that. It's easy not to hear that.
Just going back to Keith, because he's such a great character. I love his take on management and leadership. So he at one point he's redeveloping the Satisfactory Leadership Manual, and he thinks that not everybody could be a leader, because then who would there be left to lead? And maybe there should be a manual for herd-like behaviour called Efficient Following. Just the writing is so great, Katherine. And I wanted to ask you, did the development of each of these characters come very naturally to you, or was there a lot of reworking in the manuscript to get their characters right and the dialogue and their particular sort of perspectives on life?
I think Keith came easily because he felt like a real person from Toastmasters in many ways. I've had people say that he feels unlikable, which is not really my intent, but I kind of look at it from that perspective of he doesn't change, but your perspective on him changes. Francis was different in some ways. That was more of a process to find the good bits of her and the reasons for why she was. I really loved writing the genuine friendship between Francis and Rebecca. Like, I really drew on experiences and friendships that I had in those primary school years. Just even things like those best friend necklaces were very popular when I was in primary school. And I think there were two types of people. Really, the best friend is the better half. And whether you're someone that, if you're gifting the necklace, do you give the good half of the crap half? Like, I think that says a lot about the person. But we had a lot of best friends.
All right, one of the other main characters is Neil. So Neil is a doctor, but not the medical kind. And his mother, Judy, is his coach, his public speaking coach. Judy, also, in an absolutely brilliant stroke of characterisation, I think, hand makes commemorative and collectible SpeechMakers memorabilia. It's incredible. How does Neil and Judy's relationship develop throughout the book?
Well, I got a grant as part of writing the book, and I got to go to the States, and I went to the Toastmasters International Public Speaking Competition, and there were thousands of people there. It was semi-finals and grand finals of the speaking competition. And one of the things that I noticed, and I ended up interviewing some people who were competing, was that it wasn't, you didn't just arrive as an individual. All the competitors had coaches. They had a whole entourage of bag carriers and water bottle people. Like, it was a real sort of thing. So I love this idea of having a coach in the novel, and Judy's both a public speaking coach and a life coach. Of course she is. But also just that idea of when you start out in something like that, inevitably you don't have any clients. So I think family members are so wonderfully supportive of people. So I think Neil is sort of strong-armed a bit into helping his mother.
Just
a little bit. So their relationship is one of, she's pushing him to be his best self, and he's a fairly reluctant participant in that process.
Interesting relationship between the two of them. So one message of the story, I think, is that sometimes you need to speak to others in order to confront your own inner voice. Would you agree with that?
I think so. I think of that particularly with Francis. With those characters, I sort of had sentences that I kept coming back to in how I wanted to think about them across the kind of arc of the book. For Francis, it was about telling the truth. Keith, it was about shutting up. And for Neil, it was about finding his voice. And that's sort of how I framed it in the context of speech.
Yeah, makes sense. So do you think that SpeechMakers or Toastmasters or any of those organisations are for those people who crave attention, or do you think it's for those people whose voices are so quiet that they want to learn how to be heard?
I think the latter. I think that I mentioned what a sort of awkward, kind of bit weird sort of space that it is. And initially I was not dismissive of that, but I saw ridiculousness in that in many ways, which I think a lot of people would say of their first meeting of Toastmasters. But the more I think about it, the more I think that's completely necessary for a public speaking club, because if a public speaking club was a really cool space where everyone was hip and like, you wouldn't want to stand up and be vulnerable. Like, it has to feel low stakes. Like, it has to feel safe to bare your soul, that there's a non-judgmental element.
This is kind of an off-big question, but is there anything off limits? Like, is there any rules about you can't talk about certain topics?
surprisingly not formally. People are pretty mindful. Occasionally you get a speech that maybe probably shouldn't have been done. But generally people are pretty good. Toastmaster has an air of professionalism too, so it's not uncommon for someone who has to give a speech at work just to bring the speech in and, you know, tell you about.
It must be fascinating.
Yes, some pretty random minutiae of a job. So, yeah, I mean, that's very sweet. And I can understand that compulsion too.
You mentioned about that you got the travel grant to go to the US for a 3-day conference, which just sounded really exciting. I wanted you to tell us 3 funny or standout moments from that conference that really appealed to you or that made it into the story even.
Okay, one was I went on a bus tour of the Toastmasters head office, which appears in the book. Very unremarkable office block. I had to pay $50. but, you know, that was good. But when I was on the bus, I met this young guy who was Indian Canadian, and that was his background. And he was there with his dad, but his dad was in meetings, but this was like their annual thing that they were doing with each other. And I think he was thinking about his relationship with his dad. And he told this story of how the relationship had maybe fractured a little bit. And it started when he was in grade 3 and his parents decided that they would send him to boarding school. And his dad made the decision and his mum was the one that had to tell him. And she couldn't bring herself to tell him. So the day that school started, she packed his suitcase, put him in the car, drove him to the boarding school, told him to go play in the playground, dropped his bag at the office and left.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and so he waited in the playground for a really long time and then went into the office and said, "Where's my mum?" And they said, "She's gone. She'll be back in 10 weeks for term holiday." It's just an extraordinary story.
You couldn't make that up, really, could you?
He was lovely. Yeah. Another was they had a lot of, and I do some of these in the book as well, different, alongside the competition sort of stuff, they had different sessions. And one session was by an American speaker, and his thing was, for every speech, you need a phrase that pays. And so you have to kind of distill your story into like just a, you know,
like.
none of which I can think of at the moment. So that was pretty funny.
It seemed to be a lot of those sort of add-on sessions that you could do, how to make your speaking better in 101 different ways.
Well, it is very, the vibe can be, particularly at that conference, which was had like an amazing resort and all the rest of it, it's very, everyone can be the best. You
That's
know?
very rare.
Which is, yeah, which is very rare.
We'd be like you, we'd be like, no, everybody So, look, Katherine, this book, the way it's written, is just, it's so funny, and you use wit and absurdity and satire to write really great comic material, really sharply absurd dialogue, which I think is notoriously difficult to pull off, you know, writing funny. I think it's very hard. Do you find it easy to, because the Helpline was also very funny, do you find it easy, or is it a lot of effort for you to write, to be so naturally funny?
That's very flattering. I have always liked comedy. I did like theatre-y sort of comedy and stuff at school in like little sketches and stuff. So I've always liked funny. I think the thing with funny is it's very easy to do short form funny. That is quite straightforward. I think things like McSweeney's do that really well. But for funny to really work in long form, it needs to be married with another overarching emotion. It's my theory. So you look at something like The Office, very funny, but also love. You look at Meg Mason, who wrote Sorrow and Bliss, funny and sad. Like I think you need twin emotions.
the comedy and tragedy.
Yeah, I think they need to sit alongside, because too much funny ceases to be funny.
And also it's too lighthearted. Like, that's the thing about this book. I think it is very funny and lighthearted, but it's also got these messages about, you know, her friends' past and, you know, what she feels about what she did, and, you know, guilt and shame, and a lot of really darker themes at the heart of it. But I think it's easy to digest because the writing is so good and the dialogue's so funny. You mentioned what was her name?
Judy.
I know the characters in the book. No. The trans woman that you met. Greer. Greer. So there is a character in the book called Edith, and I believe Greer inspired the character of Edith a little bit.
She did. I really laboured over that, because I think there is nothing worse than a book that contains a random character that feels clunkily inserted to make a point or something, you know. But I kept coming back to this idea that the Toastmasters that I observed is genuinely one of the most diverse spaces really I encounter in any aspect of life. And even if I had to think about how I portrayed her, I wanted her in there because she existed in the room in real life.
And it's a lovely portrayal of her. It's not overly sort of.
Well, she's not a big character or anything like that, but I had interviewed Greer for the book, and I asked if she wanted to read it before it came out, which she didn't really. She was like, it's fine. And then I sent her a copy of the book, and then I forgot I'd sent her a copy, so I sent her another copy. But she wrote back and said, very nice.
Please don't send me any more copies.
Yes. They're all addressed to me, so I try and give them away.
What about the Rogers and the Susans of this world? Tell us about them.
So Roger and Susan are part of the Toastmasters, the SpeechMakers hierarchy, and SpeechMakers is going through a transition phase where they are monetizing a lot of stuff. So a lot of the courses are very expensive. They're selling essential oils. They're, it's sort of shifting into this space, which I think exists in the self-improvement movement, that is really a capitalist version of self-improvement that might even be about feeling bad about yourself more than improving yourself. So Keith is the one that's sort of saying, it used to be better, while Susan and Roger kind of try and change.
They're driving the change, aren't they? Yeah, they're a pair of interesting characters. There's a lot of interesting characters in this book. I really liked that the ending is not neatly tied up with a bow. So it's realistic, it's slightly open-ended, and it's not entirely resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Did you know where the book was heading, or was the ending a surprise to you? You knew the end.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you just had to work out your way to get there.
To get to the end, yeah. I think that really helps. I think when I first encountered Toastmasters, I was like, I'm definitely going to write about Toastmasters. It's such a good space. And when I learned they did public speaking competitions, I thought that is great. Because it gives a narrative arc, but also
it's a big investment, Katherine. 10 years of your life in Toastmasters, so you could write this book.
But I think one of the things Toastmasters does and that I like about competition and competing in competition is, on some level, it's a bit meaningless. Toastmasters gives a lot of awards. So in a meeting, 5 people might give a speech and everyone will vote, and the person that gives the best, gets the most votes, gets a certificate. And when I'm in that room and if I've given a speech, like on the one hand, I'm like, it's just a certificate. But on the other hand, I really want it. So I really like that theme of competition, that sort of obsession with something that doesn't necessarily.
And do they give do they, like schools now, do they give like participation certificates to sort of
They do.
everybody?
I don't know if they actually give participation certificates as such. I personally would not be opposed to that.
Then at least you
I'm
have
not anti that.
Now, Katherine, you're the co-host of the First Time podcast, which everybody here, if you don't subscribe to that, you totally should. It's been going for about 4 years and it's a really great writing podcast. So I'm going to put one of your questions that you frequently ask your authors back onto you. How has being involved with that podcast helped your writing, and what's your best piece of writing advice?
It has helped, much like when Chrissy read your bio, listening to other people talk about their writing process, I think is an absolute gift. I remember when we first started the podcast, we had to sort of beg to get people on. And now we get a lot of people sort of asking to be on. So that just getting to talk to other writers is an absolute joy. I think Charlotte Wood's advice, I think a lot of writers, one of the things that you realise when interviewing a lot of writers is that everybody feels the same angst, which is not the whole of the writing process, but it's definitely part of it. So Charlotte Wood's advice, or saying that confidence is a decision, I think is a really nice piece of advice.
Yeah. That is a beautiful piece of advice. And she was your agony aunt for a little while, which was fun.
She was great. Yeah, she was
I was just waiting for people to write in with, I don't know, marital problems or something. She probably would have just answered that. Look, I think we're about on time, just about to ask some questions from the audience. So if you've got any questions for Katherine, put your hand up. And online people
We've got
as well.
a million.
We've got a million
online
Stop
questions.
talking then.
But we'll go for so that was really fascinating. Like I'm a big fan of comedy writing. I think it is really, really difficult to do and to do well. And I think it's an incredibly underrated form, which actually needs to be rated a bit higher, because it's like if you write something that's terribly sad but not really great, you suddenly are deep. But if you write something that's funny but incredibly well structured, you sometimes get overlooked. And I think that is ridiculous. So well done for, sticking to your guns and doing comedy writing well. I saw Mirandy's hand go up, so I'm going to go to Mirandy first. And then a random question from Mirandy.
Katherine, what did you speak about?
Oh.
Yeah, I was thinking, what would Laura ask? I'm going to ask it first.
Uh-oh.
And would you now go and do a speech about writing this book?
Oh,
That's a good question. I competed a little bit at Toastmasters.
Yeah.
I worked out, because I wanted to get as far as I could, and there's different categories, and I worked out that the least popular category is a category where you all just sit in a room and all the people competing sit in a room and they have a test speaker who gives a speech. They're generally not a complete beginner but not super advanced either. And then all the competitors exit the room and they come in one by one, and you do a 5-minute speech thinking of all the things that the speaker has done well and areas that they can improve. It's like that evaluation contest. Very unpopular, and I got really far.
Someone online has said, could you please repeat Charlotte's advice, because I found it difficult to hear. So could you just
It is, confidence is a decision.
Great, thank you. I will ask a question from the online audience because there's so many. One of them is, have you conquered your fear of public speaking?
I think I like it more than I ever did. I think you start to see it more as a relationship with the audience. So it's sort of not all on you. Like, speeches can go different ways with different audiences. Probably the short answer is mostly, but I also think the thing that is underrated about Toastmasters, and I'm yet to find someone that really agrees with me, is that you also care less. So I think when you do no speaking and then you do one speech, you can ruminate about every tiny little thing you did in that speech indefinitely. Whereas if you do heaps of speeches and some are amazing and some are mediocre, the mediocre ones you can just walk away and say, didn't
Go as well as yesterday, but tomorrow will be better.
Yeah, that's right.
I wonder if writing books is like that. You have really great books and the mediocre ones just
Nah,
Such a big investment.
they all break your heart. So a question from Kate. The form and structure of the competition changed so many times during drafting. How do writers know when they've arrived at the true novel?
I wonder which Kate this could
Yeah.
possibly be.
It's like a plant, doesn't it? The book originally took place across a 9-ish month period, but when I went to this conference in the States, I decided it would be better set across a similar 3-day, 4-day period. I don't know, I think it could have worked both ways. I think there's something when you're writing and it's not going as well as you want, there's something really attractive about just throwing everything away and starting again. I think you kind of hope that it will come out fully formed perfect, but I think it could have worked both ways, is probably what I don't know if that was the right call. I think I could have written a good book that was,
Two good books that were just slightly different.
Yeah.
Excellent. A question from Kim. What is your phrase that plays when it comes to the competition?
God,
You need to
I have
make
take
one up.
that. I do. I'll take that one on notice.
You do need one. You know that. Can you? How do you make time for your writing? Do you have a routine?
Historically, pre-COVID, I was very disciplined. I would get up in the 5 o'clock, drive to McDonald's, write in McDonald's for 2 hours, and then go to work. I don't really like McDonald's that much, but there's a 24-hour McDonald's near my house, near my work, so I spent a lot of time at McDonald's. During COVID, that sort of routine was probably already established, but probably 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock.
So now we've got that. There were the questions from online so far. So anybody else in the room have any questions? Yes, Laura, you're going to ask Moriarty's question.
Question. I love the Helpline. I was wondering what felt different about writing the competition from the Helpline. I love it.
Oh, lovely. The structure of it really I found very, very hard. The time period was difficult. I envisaged it as an ensemble book where you had, say, 5 or 6 characters that each had equal weighting. So I had a version that was from 5 or 6 points of view, and then I would do these changes of like, it should be third person, everything should be first person only. So I think structurally I found it really difficult. I always was attached to Keith and Francis, and that's sort of where it landed.
Having changed a novel from third person to first person, that's a really massive job.
It sounds like you feel like, I'm just taking out the eyes and putting in bays or something, but it's tedious.
Huge.
Pretty fun to it.
Chris Olsen.
The first thing I want to say is that I did Toastmasters when I was about 25, and it worked because it was at the local pub.
Oh, nice. Oh, that's perfect.
And it was, I think I was the only female as well. So that,
that's fucking good.
yeah, like I said, I didn't last that. The other thing I want to know is, and I know this was the story you heard and didn't turn up in the book, about the little boy in the boarding school.
Yeah.
Everyone kind of,
Yeah.
I know, he was the most lovely guy, and he, did you want to ask what?
Well, 2 things. Tell me that he didn't turn into a serial killer.
No, he was the most gentle person. He was,
There's hope for bad lovers.
Did he treat it as money?
no, he was like, we just had this really unusually deep conversation. Because he was there with his dad, and my dad had just died, so we were sort of talking about dads. And I was sort of thinking, you're at this conference with your dad, you live in separate cities, you're here for 3 days together, but your dad is at the AGM and you're sitting on the bus with me. But then we started talking about, he really loved both of his parents very deeply, but he said he thought they'd done the wrong thing, that they should have told him. And I said, would you ever say that to them? And he said, no, I wouldn't want to upset them. And even when they came at the term holidays, I said, did you say to them, like, I wish that you had not dropped me off in quite that way? And he said, I was just so happy to see them that I never said it. And then when he was, I think in year 12, there was another child that was dropped off at the same age in grade 3. And it was quite unusual at the school to be that young. And I think the teachers and the staff sort of said, oh, you know, you arrived at the same kind of age, maybe you can talk to him and make him feel better. And he was like, there's nothing I can say.
Oh, that's
But he was well adjusted, he loved his parents, he was the most lovely person. Yeah.
I asked for two reasons.
was
One was
okay.
that my former husband was in that sort of situation as an 8-year-old in the UK. He
Yeah.
was dropped off at a boarding school at the beginning of an incredibly long drive to one of those Gothic looking houses, you know, like, and he almost did turn the not quite, you know, sort of. But the real question is, you know, was you taken enough of that story to think, ooh, there's a novel?
Well, it was funny, I'd finished the book and then someone at work I had told that story to, and she was like, oh, is that guy that you met at the conference at the boarding house? And I was like, damn it, how did I forget that? Yeah.
What's your next book?
Yeah, it's a whole.
I don't know how you're going to make that funny. I was going to ask you, Catherine, characters like Francis and John Tillman from the Rosie Project and Jermaine from the Helpline, and who else? Eleanor Oliphant. What is it about those kind of characters that we all love to read about them, and they all make perfect sort of fodder for a humorous story?
I see, I have a background in engineering and I see a lot of that type of person that hits the target but misses the point sometimes. And it's like a thing you see in engineering where you design a perfect sewer, like it's an amazing sewer, but no one can build it because it's, you know, so you sort of, you've achieved perfection in one aspect, but you've done it in such a way that can't exist in the real world. And I think that, to me, is what appeals about some of these characters.
So, question.
Hi. I wanted to ask, so in the book, you've got characters who often are wanting to say speeches about things that they've never told another person before. Was that your experience in Toastmasters as well? People would be speaking to strangers about really emotional, deep topics that they wouldn't say maybe to like their wife or their family.
I think really in the impromptu speaking section, you would get a random topic, and that's when people would, because you can't prepare for a random topic, that's often where things came out sometimes a bit unedited. I've never heard any horrible things, but I think, so in that is one example, but then in the competition and high levels of the competition, I think people have really stories that have been really life-changing for them, domestic violence or, you know, death of people. So you would have those stories that could be of hardship or very deep stories, but they had processed it enough to make kind of be better friends.
What was your worst impromptu speech?
The first, I did a little bit of competing outside of the evaluation contest, and the first competition I went in was an impromptu competition, and I think I probably saw it for 12 seconds or something like that. Yeah, that was pretty great.
You just didn't know the topic, or you just didn't feel comfortable speaking?
Some topics are easier than others. Like if you, some topics just trigger a good story. I think it was something like, ouch, I've put my foot in it, or there's gum on my shoe, or something like that just really have fun. Yeah. You can do, and you sometimes see when people do it, where you think, oh, I've got 5 good stories, I can perhaps shoehorn them into anything that I get given, but really, it doesn't.
Which is a bit like, that's a bit like debating too, isn't it? You can try and
get
your point in.
Yeah.
Any last question from the audience here? I think we might was that a question? No. Okay.
Well, I would like to say before you officially close that whether public speaking excites you or frightens the hell out of you, this book will definitely make you laugh. So please go and buy lots of copies for all your friends. And everybody, please thank Katherine Collette.
So lovely to have Cass back with us again after a big hiatus. We are going to have lots more interstate authors now that everyone has Omicron and don't care anymore about getting sick. So it's really fantastic to have you with us as our second only interstate author in a very long time. And so thank you for being with us. Thank you to Text for braving it. A lot of the publishers haven't been braving it, so thank you for Text for doing that. And now is the chance for you to get your book signed. So to make that a little bit more COVID safe, we're going to do it out in here so that it's in the open air. So we'll set up this table as a signing table, and feel free to grab your copy and to come back and get your copy signed. Excellent. Thank you. Do remember your masks inside, though. Yeah.